This episode contains discussion of gun violence, war trauma, murder, PTSD, grief, revenge, torture, organized crime, and the death of family members. Listener discretion is advised. Most people think the Punisher was born the night Frank Castle's family died. They are wrong. The Punisher was born long before that. He was born in war zones where young soldiers learned survival, often belonging to the people, willing to become something colder than fear. He was born in sleepless nights filled with gunfire, smoke, and the terrible understanding that violence changes people in ways that never fully leave them afterward. Every deployment, every body left behind, every moment where survival depended on pulling the trigger before someone else did. Piece by piece, war was already teaching Frank Castle how to live without softness long before tragedy ever reached his home. But war still left him with something human, a wife, children, a reason to believe he could return home and become someone other than the man violence kept shaping him into overseas. And for a while, he almost did. Then one afternoon in Central Park, everything stopped. Not cleanly, not dramatically, just sudden chaos. Gunfire echoing across families trying to enjoy an ordinary day. Panic, blood, children screaming. A man forced to watch the people he loved die in front of him while the world around him collapsed into noise and helplessness. That was the moment Frank Castle disappeared, because the thing that came back afterward was no longer trying to survive the war. It was trying to continue it. And maybe that is what makes Frank Castle so terrifying. Not that he kills criminals, but that somewhere along the way, punishment became the only thing keeping him alive at all. Welcome to Street Level, a cinematic Marvel lorecast exploring the vigilantes, criminals, corruption, and emotional wreckage hidden within the shadows of New York City. This is not a story about heroes celebrated beneath bright lights or battles fought high above the clouds. This is a story about what happens when grief hardens into obsession, when violence becomes routine, and when someone loses so much of themselves that war starts feeling like more familiar than peace could ever again. Because cities like New York do not simply create survivors. Sometimes they create people who stop believing survival is enough. The streets remember every shooting, every body left behind in alleyways and abandoned buildings, every criminal empire feeding itself through fear, while ordinary people learn quickly that justice moves slower than violence does. Over time, that fear changes entire neighborhoods. It teaches people to lock their doors earlier, to avoid eye contact, to stop expecting someone else to save them before another tragedy appears on the evening news. And somewhere inside all of that chaos walks Frank Castle. Not a symbol of hope, not as a hero, but as punishment. To criminals, he is a ghost carrying military precision through the underworld, one body at a time. To law enforcement, he is a nightmare impossible to fully control. To the innocent, he exists somewhere between protector and warning sign. Proof that violence can destroy monsters while simultaneously creating new ones in their place. Tonight's story belongs to Frank Castle, a soldier, a father, a man who survived losing everything except the war still raging inside him. Before Frank Castle became the Punisher, he was something much simpler. A husband, a father, a Marine trying to hold together two completely different versions of himself. Because war does not always end when the soldiers come home. Sometimes it follows them quietly into ordinary life. into family dinners, into sleepless nights, into the silence sitting between conversations people do not know how to have anymore. Frank Castle carried violence long before New York ever learned to fear his name. But for a time, the people he loved gave him something powerful enough to keep that darkness contained, at least temporarily. Because the tragedy of Frank Castle is not the violence that created him, it is that violence that was the only thing waiting for him after everything else was taken away. Before the skull symbol, before the body armor, before entire criminal organizations began whispering about the Punisher like an approaching natural disaster, Frank Castle was a United States Marine, a soldier trained for violence in environments where hesitation could mean death, not only for himself, but for everyone standing beside him. Combat shaped Frank early. Discipline, aggression, survival instincts, and tactical precision became part of who he was long before the tragedy turned those skills towards the streets of New York. And yet, despite all that, Frank still built a life outside of war. Maria Castle and their children represented something war could not give him: peace, stability, humanity. Around them, Frank was not simply a Marine hardened by conflict overseas. He was a husband trying to reconnect with an ordinary life, and a father attempting to hold on to memories of happiness before deployment inevitably pulled him away again. The Castle family became the emotional center of Frank's identity. They grounded him. They gave him a reason to believe he could eventually become something more than a weapon constantly moving between battlefields. But war leaves marks people rarely see clearly from the outside. Even during his years with Maria and the children, there are signs Frank never fully escaped the violence shaping him internally. Hypervigilance, emotional distance, the quiet tension many soldiers carried home after prolonged exposure to death and survival trauma. Frank loved his family deeply, but part of him already belonged to the conflict long before Central Park. Combat had rewired the way he viewed danger, morality, and human behavior itself. Violence no longer shocked him in the ways that shocks ordinary people, because war had taught him repeatedly that brutality often arrives suddenly and without fairness. And still, his family gave him something close to hope. And that matters because it makes what happens later infinitely more devastating. The Castle family was not simply Frank's happiness. They were proof he still had something human left inside him, worth protecting. Every ordinary moment, birthdays, family dinners, quiet afternoons together, became evidence that maybe the violence-consuming parts of him overseas had not fully won yet. Frank was not emotionally expressive in the ways many people expected, but his loyalty and love for his family anchored him to a world outside of combat. Then came Central Park, and in a matter of seconds, Frank Castle lost the only thing strong enough to pull him away from war permanently. Because when Maria and the children died, the man trying to live with peace died with them. People like to imagine grief arrives all at once, one moment that changes everything forever. But for Frank Castle, grief becomes something slower and far more dangerous. Not simply sadness, not mourning, transformation. Because after Central Park, Frank is left standing inside a world that suddenly feels hollowed out beyond recognition. The future he imagined for himself disappears overnight, leaving behind only silence, rage, and the terrible realization the violence he spent years surviving overseas has now followed him home permanently. And somewhere inside that emptiness, the war begins again. The massacre in Central Park becomes the defining fracture of Frank Castle's life because it destroys more than his family. It destroys his belief that violence exists somewhere separate from ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives. For years, Frank understood brutality as something tied to war zones, criminal operations, and battlefields far away from home. But in a single afternoon, that illusion collapses completely. Gunfire tears through families enjoying a normal day together, and Frank is forced to watch helplessly as the people he loves most disappear in front of him before he can stop it. But that helplessness changes everything. Frank Castle is trained for combat. He is a Marine conditioned to react under pressure, protect the people around him, and survive situations that would break most human beings psychologically. But none of those skills mattered in that moment. Training cannot save Maria. Tactical instincts cannot shield his children from random violence erupting without warning. The man who spent years surviving war suddenly discovers there are some situations no amount of preparation can control once chaos begins. And after the shooting ends, something inside Frank breaks permanently. Grief by itself is devastating enough. But Frank's trauma quickly mutates into obsession once he begins uncovering the truth surrounding the massacre. Organized crime, corruption, cover-ups, and systemic failure all begin revealing themselves beneath the surface of what initially appears to be random violence. The deeper that Frank digs, the more impossible it becomes for him to believe justice will arrive through legal systems already compromised by the same criminal forces responsible for destroying his family in the first place. That realization is where the Punisher truly begins, not simply from pain, but from the complete collapse of faith. Frank stops believing institutions protect innocent people because his own life becomes proof they often fail catastrophically when protection matters most. Law enforcement struggles against corruption. Criminal organizations continue to operating despite overwhelming violence. Powerful people survive through influence and fear, while ordinary families pay the price. To Frank, the system no longer appears broken temporarily. It appears fundamentally incapable of stopping predators before more innocent people die. And once he reaches that conclusion, violence starts feeling logical. That is what makes Frank Castle such a morally unsettling character. His worldview is horrifying, but it is built upon experiences many people can emotionally understand. Rage after loss, the desire for revenge, the desperate need to make suffering mean something after tragedy destroys everything familiar. Frank simply takes those emotions further than most people ever could. He stops seeing violence as a failure and begins treating it as necessary correction. The Punisher emerges from grief, transformed into mission. Every criminal becomes another reminder of the people responsible for taking his family away. Every act of punishment becomes another attempt to impose an order on a world Frank now views as irredeemably corrupt. He no longer believes that peace is possible for himself personally. What remains instead is purpose, cold, brutal, and endlessly self-destructive purpose. Because after Central Park, Frank Castle stops trying to rebuild his life. He starts trying to wage a war against the people he blames for destroying it. Most people think vengeance has an ending. One final confrontation. One last body. One moment where the anger finally burns itself out and leaves something human behind again. But vengeance does not work that way. Not for someone like Frank Castle. Because after enough violence, revenge stops being an action and starts becoming identity. The mission replaces grief slowly enough that the person carrying it barely notices what they are turning into along the way. Every criminal killed creates temporary relief, but never peace. Every war fought simply leads to another target waiting somewhere deeper in the city's underworld. And eventually, Frank Castle stops fighting to avenge the dead. He fights because war has become the only version of life he still understands. The Punisher does not operate like other vigilantes inside New York. Men like Matt Murdock still believe criminals can be redeemed. Heroes like Spider-Man protect people while desperately trying to preserve their own humanity in the process. Even damaged figures like Jessica Jones continue searching for ways to survive without fully surrendering themselves to violence completely. While Frank Castle abandoned that search a long time ago. To Frank, criminals are not misunderstood people capable of rehabilitation. They are active threats, predators who will continue destroying innocent lives for as long as they remain alive. His worldview is brutally simple because trauma and military conditioning have stripped away almost every moral gray area surrounding violence. The law moves too slowly. The courts fail repeatedly. Organized crime rebuilds itself faster than institutions can dismantle it. Frank looks at that cycle and reaches a horrifying conclusion. Permanent problems require permanent solutions. And that philosophy transforms him into something terrifying even within the world of vigilantes. The Punisher does not hide behind symbolism or mythology the way many masked figures in New York do. There is no secret identity protecting pieces of Frank Castle's personal life, because there is barely a personal life to protect anymore. Frank exists almost entirely inside the mission. Safe houses, weapon caches, surveillance operations, military precision applied to organized crime like an endless battlefield spreading across the city, one target at a time. In many ways, Frank treats New York City like it's occupied, and that is what separates him psychologically from the heroes like Daredevil. Matt Murdock still fights to save Hell's Kitchen. Frank Castle fights to eliminate enemies. One worldview leaves room for mercy. The other leaves room only for efficiency. Criminal organizations fear the Punisher, not because he arrests people or exposes corruption publicly, but because encounters with him often end with bodies instead of prison sentences. And perhaps the most tragic part is that Frank understands exactly what he has become. There are moments throughout his story where exhaustion slips through the rage long enough for the audience to see the reality underneath the violence. Frank is not emotionally fulfilled by killing. He is not secretly healing through revenge. War consumes him constantly, isolating him from ordinary human connection until punishment itself becomes the only thing giving structure to his existence anymore. Because without the mission, Frank Castle would have nothing left to survive for. And that is the terrible contradiction sitting at the center of the Punisher. The same violence destroying his humanity also keeps him moving forward. Every criminal operation dismantled creates temporary purpose strong enough to silence grief for another night. Every war against corruption delays the moment Frank would otherwise be forced to sit alone with the emptiness left behind after his family's death. And deep down, part of Frank may understand the war can never actually end, because if it did, he would finally have to confront what remains of the man underneath the skull symbol. The longer someone lives inside violence, the harder it becomes to imagine anything existing outside of it. And that is the tragedy of war. Not simply the death it leaves behind, but the way it reshapes identity until survival itself becomes linked to conflict. For Frank Castle, vengeance begins as grief with direction, but over time, the mission grows larger than people he originally lost. The Punisher stops being something Frank does, and slowly becomes the only version of himself he still recognizes anymore. And that leaves one final question hanging over every body left behind in his wake. Can someone consumed by war ever truly come home again? Frank Castle survives by refusing to stop moving. And that is the reality underneath nearly every Punisher story. The moment Frank slows down long enough to process everything he has lost, the grief waiting underneath the violence threatens to consume him completely. So he keeps going. Another target, another operation, another criminal network feeding on itself through fear and exploitation somewhere inside New York. The mission becomes structure, routine, a reason to wake up in a world that no longer contains the people who once gave his life meaning. But survival built entirely around punishment comes with the consequences. Over time, Frank becomes increasingly isolated from ordinary humanity. Relationships collapse before they can truly form because intimacy requires emotional vulnerability he no longer knows how to tolerate safely. Trust becomes almost impossible. Peace feels unnatural. Even in moments of temporary quiet carry tension beneath them because Frank has spent so many years preparing for violence that his body no longer fully understands how to exist without expecting war around the next corner. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this? There are moments where Frank almost remembers who he used to be. Brief flashes of humanity survive beneath the armor. Conversations with other veterans. Children reminding him of the family he lost. Rare moments where exhaustion cracks through the mission long enough for grief to surface honestly instead of transforming itself immediately into rage again. Those moments matter because they reveal something important. Frank Castle is not emotionless. The Punisher exists precisely because Frank feels too much and no longer knows how to survive those emotions without violence giving them direction. And that complexity is what separates Frank from simple revenge fantasies. The Punisher is not aspirational, he is tragic. Every criminal he kills pushes him further away from the man Maria and the children once loved. The war consumes him more every year, and yet stopping feels almost impossible because vengeance has become intertwined with identity itself. Frank cannot imagine peace because peace would force him to confront the horrifying possibility that nothing he does will ever truly undo what has happened to his family. And deep down, he probably already knows that. And that is why Frank Castle remains one of the darkest figures in the street-level world of Marvel. He represents the terrifying possibility that trauma, grief, and violence can hollow someone else so completely that war itself becomes the only thing left holding them together afterward. Not because they enjoy it, but because they no longer remember who they were before it. Frank Castle tells himself that war is about justice, about protecting innocent people from predators the system refuses to stop permanently, about punishment, consequence, fear directed towards the people who spend their lives spreading suffering through neighborhoods already drowning in violence. And in many ways, some of what Frank does undeniably work. Criminal organizations collapse, human traffickers disappear, murderers and abusers who would have continued destroying lives simply never get the chance again. But beneath all of that violence sits a far more uncomfortable truth. The war that also keeps Frank alive. Because once revenge becomes the foundation of someone's identity, stopping starts feeling terrifying. The mission gives structure to grief that would otherwise consume him completely. Every operation, every target, every night spent hunting criminals delays the silence waiting underneath it all. The Punisher does not simply punish evil. He protects Frank Castle from fully confronting the emptiness left behind after his family had died. And maybe that is the real tragedy at the center of this story. Not that Frank became violent, but that violence became the only place where he still felt purposeful at all. That raises the question every Punisher story quietly asks beneath the gunfire and body armor. When vengeance becomes the only thing keeping someone alive, what happens if they ever stop? Because peace would require Frank Castle to become human again, and after years of war, grief, and punishment, he may no longer believe he deserves to be. New York keeps producing people like Frank Castle, not because the city creates monsters out of nowhere, but because violence spreads through broken systems faster than healing ever does. Another family loses someone to crime. Another veteran comes home carrying wars nobody around them fully understands. Another frightened person looks at the corruption and begins wondering whether mercy actually changes anything anymore. And somewhere beneath the sirens, the rain, and the flickering streetlights, the Punisher keeps moving, not towards peace, not towards healing, but towards the next war waiting for him somewhere inside the city. And maybe that is why Frank Castle endures as such a haunting figure. Because beneath the skull symbol and the endless violence is a man trapped inside grief so overwhelming that punishment became easier than learning how to live without it. And maybe the scariest part of all of this? Part of the city understands exactly why he exists. This has been Street Level, Stories from the Shadows of New York City.